we thought about a collusive arrangement. We understood there were three tasks you had to figure out. Do you take a bunch of people who are acting kind of competitive with each other, and they can get together and say, well, why don't we act in concert? Why don't we act in a way that will allow us to get price higher? And if they agree to, they have to solve what's that high price? How much do we have to get that high price? Entails us having to restrict market output by how much? And who's going to take what share of that? And how are we going to build a policing mechanism to make sure you stick to that quota that you have agreed to allow us to get this price up so high? Now, the example we used was called the OPEC cartel. Economists typically refer to cartel to mean a collusive arrangement that's above the law. It's something that happens because for many years, the international air cartel was a recognized cartel where airlines from the United States and airlines from, let's say, Europe, would get together and talk about the number of flights, the frequency of flights, and the prices of flights that went international. Now, that was taken away, but for a while it was sort of a legal cartel. Economists refer to cartel to mean something that is sort of above the law. They refer to a collusion as something that is against the law. And in the United States, we have laws against that, and I want to first motivate why we have these laws and then talk a bit about what the laws are. So let's think about a typical industry. Suppose this industry was, in the first place, operating competitively. So we'll say it's operating here at PC and QC. Then we know that under this situation, this triangle would represent consumer surplus, and this triangle would represent producer surplus. Okay, so we'll call this consumer surplus under competition, and we'll call this producer surplus under competition. Now suppose a cartel occurs. The cartel comes along and it successfully restricts output to drive up price. What's that look like? Well, the cartel is going to find some optimal price and output scheme, which we'll just call P star fix and Q star fix. And remember, I'm not sure where this comes from. We talked about the fact that maybe they just focus in on what the monopolist would do, because the monopolist definitely makes the most money. The monopolist is the expert at wringing the most profits out of an industry. But maybe they don't go all that way because they don't want to set off any bells and whistles in the Justice Department about, hey, what happened in this industry? How come those prices jumped up? And so they come up with some higher price and quantity. From our point of view, what's important here is to think about the social cost. We know that in the old days, that is on the slide we just showed, all the area below the demand curve and above the supply curve, which is the supply curve is just equal to the sum of our marginal cost, that entire area in that shaded zone was the size of the pie. Well, in this new world order, the consumer surplus has shrunk down to the area above price, below demand curve. All right, there are people who are standing on this curve saying, yeah, I got a pretty high price. I used to like it a lot better, however, when the high willingness to pay. I liked it a lot better when the price was lower, but they're still getting a little consumer surplus, not as much. And of course, the industry itself has now increased producer surplus to this trapezoid. Okay, so we'll say that this is consumer surplus in the fix, and this is producer surplus in the fix, and that leaves this area as something that's missing, and that area we have traditionally called the dead weight loss. The dead weight loss is a missing piece of the pie. The pie has shrunk down by that amount. As we noticed in the case of monopoly, when the pie starts shrinking because of the market is not performing in the way we'd like it to, the government will probably get involved, and in this case, they're going to get involved by making collusion illegal. So we've established in an earlier slide that the Sherman Act, Section 1, prohibits restraint of trade. An example is price fixing, getting together behind closed doors and determining some price that you'd like to have everybody set. Is against the law. It's a restraint of trade. There are other restraints of trade. You also can't get together and decide that, hey, let's all just cut back on our advertising by 30%. If we all cut back on our advertising by 30%, we'll still have the same number of people that are coming to smoke our cigarettes or drink beer. It's just that we won't have to give so much money away to the TV station. That's illegal. Okay, you can't have these types of constraints to restrain trade. Okay. Now, the interesting thing is when we talked about Sherman Act Section 2 about monopolization, we said you had to show that there was a monopoly and then show that it was a bad monopoly. In this case, price fixing is illegal per se. And per se means that it's illegal if it exists. Okay? In other words, if you can show me that these guys are fixing prices, that's it. The court will not entertain any justification from the defendants. They can't say, well, we did it by accident, or we did it because we're a failing industry, or we did it because of competition from Asia. There's no excuse. There's absolutely no part of the trial that permits excuse. Once the facts of the case are put forward, the court decides whether there was indeed price fixing, and if there was price fixing, there's no mitigating plea permitted. It's per se illegal. The relief for price fixing cases, it's important. Relief is what's the government want? In the case of monopoly, what the government wants is to make the industry act like a competitive industry, because the government, just like the benevolent dictator, recognizes that the competitive industry gets as close as possible to making the pie as big as possible. Okay? When the monopolist restrains output, the pie shrinks. If the government wins a monopoly case, their relief is what we call structural change. Okay, so when John D. Rockefeller and Standard Oil lost that monopoly case in 1911, what the government did is they went in and broke the company up. So it became Standard, Exxon, Ohio, Mobil. All of these companies were just torn. The one big company was torn asunder into a collection of other smaller companies that the government deemed there would be enough there to have a competitive outcome, rather than just having one monolithic oil company. In the case of price fixing, the relief is to prohibit behavior. That is, the government believes the industry itself is well suited for competition. It's just that some executives decided to do something that we just don't like. Okay? So we're making that illegal, and if we find that you actually did it, then we're going to punish you, and we're going to say, we're going to put injunctive relief in, you can't do that anymore, you can't do this, you can't do, and it's a very complicated issue. Most industries in the United States have trade associations, and the trade association will put out little monthly documents about the industry. I mean, if you're not in the industry, they're not exactly the most exciting news. It's like, somebody came up with a new line of paintbrushes, and somebody has this, and this guy got promoted, and there's these black and white photos of people who are getting promoted. But there's usually at the back a bunch of data that talks about how many cans of paint this firm produced, or how many kitchen sinks this firm produced. The government oftentimes will try to take that to the courts and say, why are they sharing all this information? They don't need to do that stuff. They're paying a third party, that's the trade association, to gather data and publish it so they each know what each other's doing. That the Department of Justice argues that's kind of like they're building in detection mechanisms to see how much everybody's going out the back door of everybody's firm so that we can keep track of each other. Now, that's a real hard thing to say, because we like good information. Industries with bad information, with weak information, those are notoriously inefficient. So the court has really not been too, let's say, eager to impose restraints on that type of stuff. If the Department of Justice shows them a memo that says, hey, let's raise the price by 10% and keep it that way for the next 2 weeks, well, then you're going to go to jail. And finally, that's actually one last important thing I want to talk about, is that basically for about the first 70 years of antitrust case, the only thing that happened if you got caught was there was a fine imposed. And people came to treat the fine as if it was just sort of like a cost of doing business. It's just another cost curve. And then about 30 years ago, the Department of Justice decided, you know what? We're going to pursue criminal activity on this. And that means if we win, people are going to jail. Now, since that time, every one of these price fixing cases has involved people going to jail. And it has made a big deterrent effect. It's one thing if you get caught and the company's going to have to pay a fine. It's another thing if you, a high-flying executive in the C-suite who's making a pretty good income, are suddenly going to have to leave your family and go spend the next 3.5 years in a federal penitentiary. It might be one of these country club places where you play a lot of golf, but you're still out of the loop. You're not running a company anymore. It's and that type of change has made a big difference.